Alright, I'm going to tie a slight variation to a pheasant tail nymph, and this is going to be a tungsten pheasant tail nymph, and it's going to be a flashback. So I'm starting off with a size 14 nymph hook in the vise, and I've added a 3/32 tungsten bead head to this, and I'm going to make it a little heavier, so I'm going to take my wraps of lead and give it about 10 turns or so. And just move that all together and press down that end section. Push that up into the bead head. The thread that I'm going to use is an A-dot black, and I'm just going to get that started right behind the lead. Wrap a couple through, and then I'll bring that down to about the point of the hook. Now it's time for the pheasant tail, and for that I'm going to use a dark pheasant tail for this. You can get pheasant tail in all sorts of different colors, and so I'm going to take maybe 8 fibers or so of my dark pheasant tail. I'm going to measure this out to be about a hook shank in length, and I'm just going to start making a couple of wraps down to the barb of the hook. And now I can tie in my ribbing material, and I'm going to use just a gold rib for this, and so I'm going to tie that right into the side as well and bring that down to the same point. Now for these larger pheasant tails, the 12s and the 14s, you can get away with this next step, which I'm just going to bend the pheasant tail back on itself and tie that in tight. When you get into smaller sizes, your best bet is to cut off the tip, or cut it off and then tie in a new section by the tip. So I'm just going to advance the thread back to about the thorax starting point. So now if I'm looking at the front of the hook, I want to make counterclockwise wraps, and so that I get a good cross section when I bring my ribbing up the opposite way. So I'm just making some nice even wraps. These fibers are going to want to twist up as you bring them around, so I'm just untwisting them as well. And I'll advance the pheasant tail fibers past my thread, so that way I can make one big loop up and secure it, and then tie it down on itself. And I'll come back through then and trim those butt sections. Now I can advance my ribbing in the opposite direction. So now again, if I'm looking at it, I'm going to make clockwise wraps. I just want nice even wraps all the way up through. And I'll bring it up to the thorax point, and then I'll tie that off. Now I can just helicopter that off. So up until now, it's been a pretty traditional pheasant tail, and the only slight change that I make, instead of tying in the pheasant tail and making that my wing case, I'm going to use pearl tinsel and also mottled oak thin skin to give it the same sort of look that you'd have with a, well, like a copper john or something like that. So I'm just going to take a section of my pearl flash, my pearl tinsel, and I'm going to tie that in to the top of the fly here. And then I'm going to take my thin skin and I'm going to cut just a V shape so that I have a better spot to tie in. And I'll just tie that right on top. And I want my thorax to be a little bit bigger than a bead width worth of thorax. And that material I'm going to use a peacock curl, so I'm going to take 2 strands of peacock. And I'll trim the butt sections and then tie those in. And at that point then I can start making my wraps. I always try to double back on itself at least one time to make sure that they're tying in on top of each other. And then I can trim. Now before I tie my casing on, this is the point where I tie in my legs. And I do that because if I have any butt sections of my legs that stick out, I can cover it up with my thread and with my wing casing. So now I'm going to go back to this same pheasant tail, and I'm going to take some of the finer fibers, and I always take more than I think I'm going to use with this. So if I'm looking at the stem, I'm going to take about an inch section or so, and I'm going to pull those out. You can trim off the ends if you want, but those are going to be my legs. What happens is they compress when you tie them in, and it looks like less volume. And now I'm just going to tie these in right to the side. I want it to stop just short of the butt of the fly, and so I'll just hold them up and take 2 turns, and I'll do the same thing to the other side. So I've got my section here, just match them up against the side, and then tie that in as well. And at this point, if you're long on one side, you can always adjust by pulling it out. Now I'll come back through and clean up those end sections. And you'll see now I've got these little tiny ends sticking out, and so what I can do now is when I pull my thin skin over, it's going to help hide some of that. So I'm stretching it nice and tight, and I'll put in a turn or two, and then I can bring my pearl flash or pearl tinsel over and do the same. And I'll just make sure it lines up, and then I'll pull everything back in a whip finish. And I can trim that thread. And then I can take my thin skin and my pearl off. And you can see how that looks from the top. You can play with the legs, spread them out if you want. And now the last thing that I'll do is I'll take just a little bit of head cement, and I'll use Loon's hard head cement here. Sometimes I'll use Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails, and I'm just going to put a little protection over that wing case, and that'll look higher now than what it's ultimately going to be. That'll settle down a little bit. But obviously a real popular fly, real common fly, deadly effective, and that is a slight variation on a bead head pheasant tail flashback.